there were passages in the Bible that spoke to these deeper philosophical questions that I had. I had this intuitive sense that there must be something that didn't change. We live in this world, the ephemeral nature of our sense perceptions. I'll hold up this water bottle, I drop it to the table. I can remember now that event from 3 seconds ago, but it's permanently gone. And where did it go? And I had this sense there must be something that doesn't change, or else all this constant flux of the empirical sense perceptions of the world floating by me is ultimately meaningless. There's got to be some grounding.
Bryan Callen, this is his intro song. Bryan Callen, it's one hell of an intro song. His comedy is marvelous. He's a genius in world politics.
This is the Bryan Callen Show, ladies and gentlemen. Our debate today, our question is the God question. And Michael Shermer, I've interviewed you before. Stephen Meyer, I have read your book, it's a dense book. You got to pack a lunch, but it's an ambitious project. And I want to get through, let's do a short introduction of what you guys do. I'll let you guys give me the bio, and because you guys do a better job of it. I've heard it before. Just so we have an idea of what we're going to do. And the way I want to conduct this is I want to ask you guys my naive layman's question. Full disclosure, I find Dr. Stephen Meyer's argument to be something I'm very much romanced by. The fix is in. I lean in his direction. I believe in some kind of a God. Michael's an atheist, but he's a moral objectivist. So we're going to get into all these questions, and I can't wait. You guys are, you have bigger brains than I do, and I really appreciate the fact that you are willing to take these questions on in good faith, and you're unrelenting, and I think you're very important voices. So, Dr. Stephen Meyer, welcome. You've written this book. I want to get it right. It's The Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 discoveries that reveal the mind behind the universe. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do? You have your PhD in the philosophy of science.
Right, PhD in the philosophy of science. My background was in physics and earth science, and I did the PhD was in on the subject of origin of life biology, which I did at Cambridge University, and I taught at the university level for 12 years after finishing the PhD, and then went to head up a program at the Discovery Institute, the Center for Science and Culture, where I've been since 2002. We're kind of the international hub of scientists and philosophers who are challenging, for lack of a better word, scientific materialism, the worldview of scientific materialism, the worldview that says that science supports a no design, no God, no purpose perspective on the universe, that matter and energy are the things from which everything else comes, and you can explain everything by reference to
matter and energy. So cozy.
Yeah.
So cozy when you're dealing with tragedy.
Yes.
You lost your child. Listen, everything's matter and energy.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, we're so I head up that program. We've got research projects now all over the world, and a group of about 40 to 50 affiliated fellows who are scientists and philosophers who are sympathetic to this perspective.
Yes, and you've done your best in this book to make an objective, measurable, empirical argument for the idea that there is some kind of a mind behind the universe, that there is a design behind the designer.
Right. I've written 3 big, fat, probably overly long books, Signature in the Cell, Darwin's Doubt, and now Return of the God Hypothesis. The first 2 books were making the argument that we see in biology, in particular with things like the digital code and the nanotechnology in cells, evidence of a designing intelligence of some kind. In this 3rd book, I address the question, what is the identity of that designing intelligence, or what else can we know about the attributes of that designing intelligence, and what can science tell us about that? And so I broadened the scope of inquiry to include physics and cosmology as well as biology. And you're right, it's an ambitious project, but something I've been thinking about for 35 years, and happy to finally have it done.
That's awesome. And Michael, first of all, thank you, because your book Conspiracy I draw upon, because I have a podcast called Conspiracy Social Club, where Sam Tripoli, the great comic that he is a conspiracy theorist. And I'm constantly referencing your book to debunk all the insanity out there. And I like the subtitle of your book, which is Why the Rational Believe the Irrational. And you've always been somebody that you're kind of one of my go-tos because you've just always kind of, you created Skeptic magazine, and you're at the helm over there. And you're always the one who says, not so fast. This might be magical thinking. So can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah,
you have your PhD in the philosophy of science.
History of science, yeah.
History of science, right.
And I also have a graduate degree in experimental psych. And then I had a 10-year gap in there in which I was a professional bike racer. So
damn.
Yes,
An athlete
cool.
and a scholar, dude.
That's very cool.
And Stephen boxes. So I love it, man.
So afterwards, we're going out.
But I appreciate that. I appreciate when
Michael
scientists.
outrun us on
yeah,
that racing bike. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't know. I got 2 artificial hips now. So.
I didn't know you were a professional.
Yeah, I raced across America, the 3,000-mile transcontinental bike race, which I did 5 times, and then I was race director for 10 years, and I owned the race with some other people, and then I don't do that anymore. But yeah, so.
Well, the first time I met Michael, I had listened to you, and I always thought of you. I thought you were like this nerd. I thought you had never done a sport, and he shows up in his bike outfit, and his arms are jacked. He's gunned, and I'm like, "What's going on?" He goes, "Well, I got some Greek, and I'm half Greek, and I bike all the time." And I was like, "This guy's athletic as shit." But I appreciate that because when you're involved in philosophy, there's something to coming into contact with objective reality,
yes.
Getting inside your body and just living life and being out there. I think it gives you an understanding you can't measure.
Well, embodied cognition. I mean, there's a whole field of study on that. This idea that you were born into the wrong body is nonsense. You are your body. That's a kind of a false dualism. But that has to do with woke stuff and gender. We don't want to get into all that. But yeah, so my day job is publishing Skeptic magazine and running the podcast, The Michael Shermer Show, in which I talk to anybody.
Right.
Like Steve and I had on, we did like 2.5 hours about your book when it came out. And I'll talk to anybody because I'm curious to know, is it possible I'm wrong in this new idea? Also, why people believe what they believe. No one, you mentioned, conspiracy theory. No one thinks that they hold some crazy or irrational conspiracy belief, because they wouldn't believe it if they thought it was completely crazy. They believe it because they think it's true. And I say, no one in the history of the world's ever joined a cult. They join a group that they think is going to be great. Right? There's no such thing as a pseudoscientist. No one in the history of the world has ever gotten up in the morning. Well, I'm a pseudoscientist. I'm going down to my pseudo lab and run some pseudo experiments to confirm my pseudo theory. They think they're doing real science, right? So how do you know what to believe? So we start with knowledge, justified true belief. What should I believe and what is justified? So I take a Bayesian approach, that is assigning a probability between, say, 1 and 99 of something being true, to the extent that you can assign a number to it. So, and I invoke Cromwell's rule, which is Oliver Cromwell, who said, "I beseech you in the bowels of Christ, you might be mistaken." Right? So Cromwell's rule in Bayesian reasoning is you never assign a 0 or 100 to anything, because we don't know. I'm not God. I'm not omniscient and omnipotent, and neither are you. Or if you prefer the secular version, there is objective reality, only I don't know what it is, and you don't either. So we have to start with, kind of a epistemic humility. I don't really know for sure. Here's what I think is true at the moment. I may change my mind, and we'll see how it goes. So that's why I like talking to people, just in case I could be wrong on this or that.
Well, I'm going to push back on that. So I'm going to start with, I'm going to pose these questions to you, Michael, and then you can piggyback because you're the skeptic here. We do know, it seems, that we're here. Most people are here who are engaged in the best that's been thought and said. We educate ourselves. We study science. We study philosophy. We study history. And I think we do it all because we want to get closer to the truth. Because there is this idea we seem to have this inherent need to know what is actually real, what is actually true, what is the bedrock I can moor into, regardless of where the winds blow. And one of the liabilities of being an intellectual and reading all the science and all the history and all the philosophy is that you find yourself moving in a circle. You asked that question when the last time you guys spoke. Will we ever come to a consensus? My suggestion is no, not as long as we keep talking the way we do, and not. I think the contribution of faith is the idea that there must be something that all of us sort of understand as truth. So my first question to you is, do you believe in an objective truth, in a higher truth, in the idea that we are? What is that thing that we're all looking for?
Yeah.
Where is that thing?
Truth with a small t. That is something confirmed to such a degree it would be reasonable to offer your provisional assent. That is to say, most people think this is there's a lot of evidence. The evidence converges to this one conclusion, doesn't converge to some other conclusion. So it's reasonable for today to assume this is true, and keep an open mind just in case it could be refuted tomorrow. The Big Bang Theory, the theory of evolution, climate change is human-caused, vaccines work or masks don't work, whatever it is.
But those are all measurable truths that rely on data
are you after
and fact.
Something else?
I am.
Well, like what?
Well, a meta truth, because I'm after the idea that there might be within those truths there might be an all-encompassing truth. So let's take.
Well, you mean so that we could even approach the question, that is rationality. That is. What's the justification for rationality? Is that what you're asking? That we can actually understand truth at all?
I'm suggesting that if you extrapolate in one direction or the other, it seems that, for example, we admire certain things and seem to our head raises and we look in the direction there as opposed to there, because we know there lies the good things we may never reach. We can't measure. I'm thinking of perfection. Let's just take the idea of Jesus Christ as the symbol. Forget Messiah or whatever the man. The idea of this 33-year-old man who sacrificed his own body for a higher principle, tortured on the cross, and said, "I love you anyway, and I forgive you." That idea. I mean, he lost everything, unjustly accused, all that stuff. And then you have Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in the world. You would think that from a measurable scientific analysis, you're better off being Julius Caesar than you are Jesus Christ. There's a lot of pain over here and a lot of pleasure in this direction.
Wait a minute, wasn't he assassinated?
Well, he may have been, but let's just take anybody like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or anybody who's lived this, or a movie star, for God's sake. It could be Brad Pitt or Ryan Reynolds. We seem to admire this other thing. We seem to admire the footsteps that Jesus walked, or even if we're not Christians, over the footsteps this other person walked. And that seems to suggest that maybe that person dovetails along the sort of the grain of the universe. There's a better way to go. What about that?
Okay, so you might be after something, say, different kinds of truths. So I make the distinction, say, empirical truths, like the examples I just gave. Perhaps the Big Bang Theory is wrong, and there's some other better theory this could happen, and so forth. But what you're talking about is maybe something slightly different, like a political truth or a religious truth or a moral truth. You know, what did Dr. King stand for?
I'm talking about an overall truth.
Yeah,
because you are
a metaphysical belief.
Yes, because Michael, you
comprehensive worldview or philosophical perspective that gives coherence to your understanding of all of reality.
I think that's what we're doing here. I think that's what we are doing here. I think that's why we are sitting down and talking, because whether we want to admit it or not, we're trying to get to a deeper understanding of the world.
I'd say that exists, that kind of truth, the search for truth as a truth.
So what is that about?
Yeah, because we have to function in the world, and we have to solve problems to survive and flourish, and that involves understanding the way the world actually is. And that's what our brains are well designed to do, and we are reasonably rational to that extent. So,
but chimps don't have that, and
well, they do to a certain extent, but far less than we do. They have a time horizon much shorter than our. We are really quite unusual as a primate. But so if you're asking, well, I don't know. So let's go back to these different kinds of truths. It's like you mentioned Jesus. So here's a question: do you mean was Jesus crucified, dead for 3 days, resurrected, and the purpose of this was to forgive our original sins and so on, as a kind of truth? The question is, do you mean that it really happened, or metaphorical truth, or a mythical truth?
For me, it's a metaphorical truth, right? For me, for example, I would say let's take democracy, the free market, the Constitution, or let's actually take the idea. Let's take monotheism for a second. Now, well, what's the value there? Well, the value is that we have one Father. So that must mean we're all brothers and sisters. The idea that we're all of the same moral worth, and our justice system is predicated upon that fact. Okay, I can't measure that. I can't measure, when we all kind of believe in equality and we speak about it.
I think you could measure it.
Well, you could measure it because it seems ultimately to create more bounty than the other way of living.
So you ask
right?
people, would you rather live in a democracy or an autocracy? Would you rather live in North Korea or South Korea? People will tell you, they'll vote with their feet. That's an objective measure of a deeper metaphorical truth or metaphysical truth of freedom and liberty, autonomy. And that's the direction our civilization's been moving, haltingly, for centuries. So I argue, contrary to actually most philosophers and political scientists and so on, this is not just an accident of history, that we're marching in a kind of direction toward more freedom and autonomy and individual choice than not.
To what end?
To what end? Ultimately, you're in control of your body. You make decisions for yourself. And a political system that encourages that is better than one that doesn't. How do I know it's better? Because if you ask the people what they'd prefer, and they're not being threatened by the dictator to be hauled off to Siberia if they give the wrong answer, they'll tell you that. We know.
But so then if that's the case, it does create not just less suffering, it also and it doesn't just encourage the angels of our better nature, it also helps human beings realize their potential to do things that are astonishing. For example, with your book, the idea that we may be one day able to figure out that there is a code to the universe. And there had to have been a first mover to that code. That's a fascinating idea. And if that's the case, then that would govern our behavior.
Well, it's interesting that the system that Michael and I both affirm, the political system, libertarian system, is predicated on a philosophical premise that is not directly observable. That is that humans are made in the image of God, that they have intrinsic dignity as a result of that, and therefore we say that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Now, with that as a premise, we can then measure whether or not people prefer to live in that type of a system that accords them that intrinsic dignity,
exactly.
or North Korea.
Right.
And I'm not going to argue with Michael about North Korea. We're entirely
But you're exactly right.
Right. So there are both observables and unobservables as we begin to think about the big questions. And the God question, I think, is a question of metaphysics, but it's also a question of science. And even the most staunch atheists inadvertently reveal that they accept that as well. Richard Dawkins, for example, has said that the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If at bottom there is no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, where blind, pitiless indifference is shorthand for undirected material processes. And I think that's an incredibly helpful statement that he makes. I'm on the opposite.
Why? Why do you think it's
because
there's something to push back on?
Well, because he frames the issue so beautifully. And what he's implying is that metaphysical beliefs, his belief in materialism as a worldview, is the opposite of which is theism or maybe deism. There's just different metaphysical positions, but that metaphysical views are testable against our observations of the world around us, every bit as much as scientific hypotheses. So he says the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if materialism is true. And what I do in the book is I say that's a really interesting way of framing the issue. Let's now test that and see if what we would expect based on the materialistic hypothesis is actually what we've discovered as we've looked at the world around us carefully.
But all men are created equal is not materialistic. It is metaphysical.
Exactly.
We are starting with I'm glad you brought that up, because the fact that we are endowed with certain inalienable rights, that is a mythology we have all embraced, and you can measure that when you embrace that metaphysical concept that actually you could disprove mathematically. It gives better measurable results, and which is also why I'm a libertarian, by the way. But individual freedom.
Right. Well, the way I put it, Bryan, is that political viewpoint is a corollary of monotheism. And what I'm interested in is the deeper question of evaluating the monotheistic metaphysical hypothesis and comparing it with its alternatives, such as materialism,
right, which is Dawkins' materialism,
which is every bit as much a metaphysical system as theism or deism or pantheism, and to see which of those metaphysical viewpoints actually comport best with the observations we make about the properties of the universe. And I think Dawkins beautifully frames the issue. I just think he's wrong in his conclusions.
Your book is rebuttal to that.
And I think there have been major discoveries in science that are precisely what you wouldn't expect from the scientific materialist or scientific atheist point of view. Number one, the universe had a beginning. Number two, the universe has been fine-tuned from the beginning to allow for the possibility of life against all odds. And thirdly, that when we look inside the inner recesses of the cell, we find digital information, nanotechnology, complex circuitry, the kinds of things that do not arise from undirected material processes, but instead, based on our uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis of all scientific reasoning, only arise from the activity of an intelligent agent. And Dawkins himself has made statements that reveal his surprise at the discoveries that are being made. 2 summers ago, he tweeted about a new animation of the DNA replication system that had been done by an Australian group. And it's too hard to describe in an audio interview but I've got animations of this type of stuff on my website. Exquisite information processing systems that are being discovered inside the cells. Not just that we've got digital code in DNA. It's
incredible.
It's that there's sophisticated, hierarchically organized information processing systems at work. And when Dawkins saw one of them animated, he said he was knocked sideways with wonder at the integrated complexity of this digital information processing system.
I'm glad. I hope it knocks some of his arrogance out of his.
Well, the point is
Wait,
that
I want to give you a chance, Michael.
I'm also a Bayesian, like Michael. Okay, and the idea that we have 3 things that allow us to test hypotheses. One is we've got an original hypothesis, whether it be a scientific hypothesis or metaphysical hypothesis. Those hypotheses about reality generate certain expectations about what we should see, the properties of the universe or life, and then we make observations to see if what we expect to see is what we actually see. And my contention in the book is that what we would expect on a intelligent design, or rather even a theistic design hypothesis.
You're making him nervous when you say theistic. Keep going.
Well, monotheistic, whatever. That what we see in the universe related to big questions about the origin of the universe, the origin of life, the origin of the physical structure of the universe. What we've discovered about those big events in biological and cosmological origins comport beautifully with theistic expectations, and they contradict the expectations of the scientific materialists. And that's the reason that scientific materialism and scientific atheism is getting so weird. That's why we've got
multiverses, and all
multiverses, alien designer hypotheses, simulation hypotheses, the universe from nothing idea that's been conjoined with quantum cosmology and Lawrence Krauss. This is where I'm also a skeptic, but I'm a skeptic about the magical thinking that materialism now entails, and so. I think Michael and I have a lot of commonality in epistemology.
Does that speak to you, Michael?
But difference in judgment about where the rub is.
Does that sway you a little bit, Michael? Does that get you to kind of like does that knock you off you're a healthy skeptic here? But that argument seems so compelling.
First of all, the blind, pitiless indifference. Planets and stars and galaxies and space-time don't care about me. They don't even know I exist, and who would think otherwise? I think the pushback against that quote from Richard is that there must be a mind out there behind the stars and planets and galaxies and space-time and so on that would care about us, something like that. It's kind of
I don't think he used the word care, though. I don't know that you said.
Well, those were here, created us, or some such thing, right?
Well, I'm just talking about the evidence for intelligent activity that you find in something like digital code or nanotechnology, or the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics and the initial conditions of the universe.
Yeah, let's stick with that idea.
Which have moved many physicists from the materialist view to the theistic view.
The idea that there is some kind of a mind, a designer. What do you think of that,
there's
Michael?
These different hypotheses, the multiverse, different versions of string theory, and so on. These are not just willy-nilly throwing them out there because we don't want to believe in God. That isn't the case at all. I just was at a conference in Wales yesterday, just returned, in which Roger Penrose was there, Brian Greene. They were debating string theory, the Big Bang, the origin of the universe, how to explain it. There is not agreement that there was a beginning called the Big Bang. Roger Penrose was there promoting his own cyclical theory of the universe, right? So there is no a beginning; it just cycles through. And
so you don't believe in the primary movement?
But my point is
that's not actually accurate. There is empirical evidence of a beginning. What Penrose does is postulate an infinite cycle of beginnings for which he has no evidence, and has to posit something called a phantom field, which other physicists have rejected on the grounds that the phantom field has attributes that no other physical field ever postulated in physics has, namely mind-like characteristics. It can reduce entropy at just the right time, in just the right way, to allegedly produce another cycle of expansion. But there's no evidence for an infinite cycle of beginnings. That's a pure theoretical postulation.
Well, but there's a lot of that's derived from the mathematics, apparently, which I don't study. That is not just a hand-waving move on the part of scientists because they don't want to believe in God. A lot of scientists do believe in God. It's just they're not using that science as a justification of that. So,
yeah, Michael, I'm not saying that any of these alternative models are motivated necessarily by atheism or materialism, although some scientists have been very clear that that is their motivation. I'm just saying that when they're invoked as explanations, they fail. The multiverse has the problem that it's based on two speculative cosmological models, string theory and inflationary cosmology, both of which require prior unexplained fine-tuning to make them plausible. So even if you go with a multiverse, you're back to ultimate fine-tuning.
Well, we're back to this circle. We're back to, I'm not any closer to the truth. I'm just in a world of theorem and theory. And let me simplify. Maybe this is a better way.
I cut him off, though. I should let him finish his point.
My larger point was that we don't know for sure, what bang, the Big Bang, what was there before the Big Bang, and so on. So there's a lot of speculation. There's no theory of everything to unite general relativity and quantum mechanics. That was one of the themes at this conference. There's half a dozen different ideas. People have their own pet theories and so on. They're very difficult to test, if at all, or maybe they eventually will be tested. That was one of the themes of this conference was you guys promoting the standard theory are going too far. You don't have the kinds of confidence you should that you would need with the evidence that we have. Therefore, it's still open to debate. Mm-hmm. So the idea that there's one theory here, and then there's the God hypothesis. No, there's actually a dozen over here, and we don't know which is the right one.
Well, that's not quite an accurate characterization of the way I argue the case, because what I show is that there are multiple cosmological models. And even the ones that are attempting to undermine the claim or the evidence for a definite beginning to matter, space, time, and energy, such as the quantum cosmological models or the cyclic model of Penrose or the Steinhardt model, that if they get rid of the beginning, they end up having subtle theistic implications for other reasons. So are
those subtle theistic implications the idea that there has to be a first mover? Is that
typically what happens? Is that if you reject an absolute temporal beginning to the universe with one of these other models, you end up creating more acute fine-tuning problems. The quantum cosmological models have that problem. That in quantum cosmology, which was the famous, the approach of Hawking and Hartle.
I don't know what that is. Sorry. Quantum cosmology.
There was a very popular book by Stephen Hawking, The Brief History of Time.
Yeah, I read it. Couldn't get
it's
look at my face.
It's a very difficult book because it purports to be
Everybody's
a popularization.
telling me how great the book is, and I know they didn't understand it because I started reading it and I was like, I go down the wormhole here, and I was like, hey man, I didn't study physics. I don't know what I'm doing here. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, in Hawking's book, he purports to get rid of the beginning in his popular book by invoking something called imaginary time, and he makes a mathematical transformation in the description of space-time, of the universe. Right. But he gets rid of the implication of a beginning to time only as an intermediate step in a mathematical procedure, and that intermediate step involves imaginary numbers, which have no physical meaning in that intermediate step. When he converts the transformation back to real time, the singularity reemerges. And in all his technical work with James Hartle up at Santa Barbara, they never get rid of the singularity. They have to presuppose the singularity to try to explain the origin of the universe using principles of quantum mechanics. And what's really interesting about and these are really the main alternatives to standard Big Bang cosmology with a definite beginning to the universe. And what's interesting in all of these models is that they end up explaining the universe by reference to pre-existing mathematics rather than a pre-existing material state. So you have this weird condition where you've got math, which is inherently conceptual, somehow producing matter. And Alexander Velikin, one of the great Russian physicists who's advanced quantum cosmology, has said, before there's matter, space, time, and energy, what tablet could these physical laws have been written on? Is it mathematics is the domain of the mind? Are we really saying, therefore, in this approach, are we implying that the universe came from a mind? And so what I do in the book is show that philosophers call this developing a robust case for something, that there's a kind of decision tree. If you go with standard Big Bang based on general relativity, you got a definite beginning, and that has an implication that's theistic. You don't like that approach, you want to go quantum cosmological, that has a different theistic implication. If you want to go with Penrose and Steinhardt, these guys create, their models create more acute fine-tuning problems, which requires a prior mind. And so it's very difficult
whether it's math or a Big Bang, there had to have been,
the materialists have a problem on any point in the decision tree. That's
because we're back to the first mover,
it's not just,
aren't we?
Yeah, it's
isn't that what it is? Aren't we back to, wasn't it Newton who talked about?
There is the need for the first cause, but there's also a problem of specificity. We live in a universe with very specific configurations of matter that create all the wonders around us. You know, the beauties of biological systems, the beauties of our planet, the stability of the solar system. And the game of physics from the beginning is to try to describe or explain everything by very simple regularities. And you don't get complexity out of regularity. If you want specified complexity, if you want to configure matter in a specific way, you can't just say, well, there was one simple law, because what laws do is describe regular patterns that repeat over and over again. Sun up, sun down. All matter gravitates. I drop the thing, it falls. I drop the thing, it falls. I drop the thing, it falls. Laws like that do not provide adequate explanations for the specificity of the genetic code or the anatomy of a turtle, or
we're talking about systems,
or the fine tuning of the universe. There is an attempt within the materialist framework to try to square a circle, to get something for nothing in terms of information, or what we call specified complexity, to get specificity out of simplicity.
Do you agree with that, Michael?
That's a fundamental problem that has not been solved by any of these models, and they all run up against it when you examine them.
Michael?
Well, if you actually talk to the people that do the work, they disagree with this. They say we can explain complexity. We can explain how genomes get more complex. Symbiosis of simpler cells into more complex cells, like Lynn Margulis's theory of symbiogenesis, that the cells we have now, these eukaryotic cells that we're made out of, have complex systems within them that were originally simpler cells, and the genomes got more complex. Purely natural, bottom-up, emergent properties of systems just symbiotically.
When you say emergent properties, what do you mean by? Can you explain emergence?
So just combining organisms into a more complex organism. This happens naturally. You don't need an intervention of some outside force to that. But let me just pull back for a second, because there's a move being made here in which we run up against something we can't quite explain, and then there's an invocation of somehow mind did it. So I want to ask, what does that mean? And why can I ask, well, what's the origin of this mind? Does the mind itself, whatever it is, God or just some super advanced extraterrestrial intelligence or whatever, doesn't it need an origin? Why is it not reasonable for me to ask, you want to go back, causal chain, well, how about one more step back to, so, well, where did that mind come from? And if your answer is, well, it always existed outside of space and time.
My answer might be something different. So my answer might be very simple. So it's a very good question, but I think we're talking about the God question here. So the reason that I don't have to go beyond that is only because we are probably looking for, we have a hierarchy of values, and there is not only there's something at the top of that value, but there's probably something that, that we have an imagination. I'll never see the number infinity. I'll never see a negative integer, but I can use those numbers, and I can use those numbers to come up with material realities. Okay, so math, even if it's theoretical math, can be used to put a rover on Mars, for example. I know that I will never see a perfect horse, but I can imagine a perfect horse or a perfect person or my perfect self. And therefore I have this idea I'm reaching for. So I think that for our purposes as human beings here in this world, the idea that there is a first mover is enough to govern not only my behavior, but to give me purpose for what I'm doing.
Well, why can't you just derive the purpose from the here and now?
I'll tell you why, because I become a relativist. So you just started talking about plural truths,
Yeah, okay.
right? You know what I mean? You were saying there are a lot of facts and there's an infinite number of truths and an infinite number of facts.
Yeah, but you don't have to be a relativist. And
why not?
It's not a choice between believing in God and absolute morality and pure relativism. No, there's lots of positions in between, like utilitarianism and ontological ethics and so on. That just derive from reason and our study of human nature. But that's a slight side of it.
Right.
Let's go back to this question of, so you want to stop the causal chain here and say that's the first cause, the mind or God or whatever. But why not just one more step? Well, and maybe the right answer is nobody actually knows. You can't go back infinitely. So we just have to say, I don't know. That seems reasonable. To me, if it turns out there is a God or a higher power or a mind or whatever, okay.
Well, that might be why.
I don't see why that would challenge.
I can answer is why not.
I'd love to hear it
whenever you want.
I'd love to hear it but just to frame that, I think one of the reasons, for example, if you were to talk to a rabbinical scholar or something, or an Islamic cleric, the idea of giving any kind of a form to God, a picture of God, or human parameters to God is sacrilege, right? It's heretical because it's not for us to understand. It's something that's beyond our comprehension. Right. So I'm just saying that would be the religious.
I mean, that could
argument.
Be, that God is the ground of all being, or something that we can't.
Like that.
It's outside of space and time, or it's so wholly other we can't understand.
But I think it's interesting that that's enough.
But then, how do you
us.
know that it's true? That is, I don't want to believe things that have to be believed in to be true. That is, I want them to actually be true.
I'm not going to go the direction of ineffable. Okay, I
Right.
think there's a more concrete way of addressing Michael's objection. First of all, I want to flag the Lynn Margulis symbiosis hypothesis, which I think is laughably inadequate now, because we know when you actually allow one bacterium to try to ingest another, the other one gets gobbled up. This it's just causally completely inadequate based on our knowledge of how biology works. And there's much deeper questions about the origin of genes and proteins that have to be answered to make evolutionary theory again plausible, which it is not. Major leading figures are now calling for a new theory of evolution because the mutation selection mechanism is inadequate to do anything more than explain small-scale variations.
So Darwin's theory of relativity.
But let's. I just flagged that.
Yeah.
The deeper question that Michael asks is a great one, and my answer to that is that the question about why invoke a mind as the prime reality, the thing from which everything else comes, as opposed to matter, and the first thing to say about that is that every metaphysical system, every worldview, has to posit a prime reality or an ontological ground of being. Every system does that. And the question is, what is the better candidate to be that thing from which everything else comes? Matter and energy or a mind? And I think, to use Dawkins's framing, that the properties of the universe suggest that a mind provides a better candidate, because the things that we see in life and the universe that require primary explanation are things that have features that we know from our uniform and repeated experience are only produced by intelligent agents. So if we want to explain the origin of life, we now know that we need to explain the digital code that's stored in DNA and RNA. That digital code has a property. It's known as sequence specificity or specified complexity or functional information. There are different synonyms within the information sciences. One of the great information scientists, Henry Quasler, said that information is habitually produced by conscious activity. We know from our uniform and experience when we see code or something that's functioning as digital code, it took a programmer to produce it. And absent materialistic explanations, and we are absent adequate materialistic explanations, and I've written a 500-page book exploring the different approaches in origin of life research that have attempted to solve this mystery. They all come up short for very fundamental theoretical reasons. We do have another cause of which we know that is capable of producing code and information, and that's a mind. Same thing when we talk about fine-tuning. Fine-tuning is shorthand for an ensemble of parameters which function jointly to accomplish some overall outcome or function. When we see systems that are finely tuned, whether they're French recipes or internal combustion engines or the interrelationship between digital code and hardware in a computer, those finely tuned systems invariably rose from an intelligent agent, not an undirected process. So I think that mind, when we see fine-tuning at the foundation of the universe, when we see information at the foundation of life, we're looking at features that, in our experience, are best explained by intelligent agency, and therefore it is more rational to posit a mind as the ground of being than it is to posit pure materialism. Michael and I both agree that we both oppose magical thinking. But the question is, what's more magical? Is it more magical to posit
a multiverse or something,
or posit causal properties, causal powers to brute inanimate matter that we know it doesn't exist based on our observation of what quarks or nucleotide bases or the chemical constituents of living things do on their own? Or is it more rational to posit a mind, knowing, as we do, that minds are real, we possess them, we know that by direct introspective experience, and that minds have certain causal powers that we also know by introspective observation of our own minds and by observing what other minds have done and can do. Mind is a real thing. It gets written out of reality, and I think we got to bring it back. This was the point of Thomas Nagel's great book, Mind and Cosmos.
Yeah, you get me. I'm swayed to your argument, but I love Michael because Michael looks like a skeptic. You're doing this. You're going, and you're like, man, literally your eyes are squinting here. You're going, this is Michael. Michael, basically, your soundbite is this. Well, yeah, and I love that about you because that's literally what your body language is saying. But are you on a Bayesian scale? Are you swayed more in Stephen's direction than Hawking's direction?
No, more of Hawking's.
Really?
Direction, yeah. So, all right, let's.
What about
Hawking was a God-obsessed atheist, and I can tell you more about that. I sat through some of his lectures in Cambridge, and I would not make him the poster child for atheism because he was tortured. You know, he proved the singularity theorem, and then spent 30 years trying to circumvent his own proof for the absolute beginning of the universe. I mean, he's a really interesting figure.
I don't know how tortured he was. I mean, his co-author, Leonard Mlodinow, is one of my best friends. And, they wrote The Grand Design together. And Len has this story about how when the book came out, he gets this call from somebody in England, Stephen's secretary, going, oh my God, you have to do all these interviews. Stephen can't do them. There's this explosive headline in The Guardian, Stephen Hawking says there is no God and he's proved it. And Len says, oh my God, we never said that. That's not what we were doing at all. Right. And so I don't know how tortured he was. I mean, he was probably more like an agnostic than an atheist, but whatever, the words are kind of loaded. Okay, a couple things. So if you take something like the economy, it's a complex adaptive system, lots of moving parts. It looks designed, but in fact, it's not designed. It's not the result of human design. It's the result of human action. And out of that human action emerges this incredible complexity, despite what the Bernie Sanders type social democrats and socialists want to say they can design the economy. They can't because there's too many moving parts. So that looks like, well, there must be somebody behind the scenes running this economy. There isn't.
Well, there were lots of somebodies, and there were also a lot of initial constraints on the possible ways of organizing society that made the economy, that makes the free market economy generate complexity within all those unspecified interactions between the players.
But there's no overarching mind saying, okay, we're going to bring this into fruition here, right? Same thing with language. There's no one saying, we're now going to use the word 9/11 from this date forward. It just, from the bottom up, kind of spontaneously emerges into complex systems.
But there is the idea of Adam Smith and James Madison and the Federalist Papers and and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights that made this free market economy.
We've got to have the rule of law, which is specified by
property
from the
rights.
top down. You've got to have property rights. You've got to have
Yeah,
a
that's
legal
right,
system that
Right.
allows for
so
retribution
there
of
does seem
grievances.
to be an overarching mind, right? There was a fixed point of
A
truth.
better example for us to debate this would be something like a genetic algorithm. Okay, and these are
But I'm just going
offered-
to make one last
All right,
point.
you go ahead. Sorry,
Okay,
Michael.
so like this microphone here is complex. It looks designed. It is designed. I could go to the Shure manufacturer and see where it's built, or I can go to Google and to see the programmers making software. Well, they won't let me in because I don't work there, but intellectual property stuff. But anyway, where can I go to see the designer of DNA or the laws of nature? Where is this designer? Where do I go to see this?
Well, where do you go to see the designer of your Apple iPhone? You don't. The designer of that is no longer on the planet. He's passed away. We make lots of inferences in science from effects back to causes that are unobservable. Whether those are, we infer dark matter, or we infer dark energy, or we infer quarks, or we infer lots of things. The structure of scientific inference is inherently indirect in that you move from the observable to the unobservable, and there's no in principle difference from inferring to dark matter or the cosmological constant or gravitational force from the effects of those things than there is to inferring an intelligence from a characteristic effect of intelligence, which is digital information.
Okay, back to the my conference I mentioned. So one of the things, the invocation of dark energy and dark matter, that's like 95% of the universe. And without invoking intelligent design or anything like that, it was just massive pushback by not outsiders, but just challengers, skeptics, let's say, of the standard model and the standard cosmology and so on that most people say they accept. You guys are just using that word, dark energy and dark matter. You don't know what it is. And they go, yeah, we don't know what it is, but we're going to figure it out. Yeah, but maybe the entire framework is wrong. So I think there is rigorous debate about just within.
I agree with that. And I think there's a lot in physics that has that property that Leibniz accused Newton of enjoining, which was occult. He called gravitation occult.
Yes.
You posit a force, you give it a name because not because you understand what the force is, but because it's a name for what the thing does, and we don't really know what it is in its essence.
Yeah. But a lot of
dark matter was posited to explain certain motions of galaxies that were inexplicable on our standard understandings of gravity. So, but the point is that science has, they're called transdictive inferences in the philosophy of science, where you move from an observable to an unobservable, and you hold to the reality of the unobservable based on its explanatory power or its superior explanatory power vis-a-vis other possible postulates. And people want to say there's something inherently irrational or anti-scientific or anti-Bayesian or anti-philosophical about inferring to agency or mind, and I want to say no, it's the exact same type of inference we make in science. It's from an observable to an unobservable. The difference is we have direct experience of what minds can do, unless we want to deconstruct our own minds,
right?
Which is what materialists invariably
idea?
End up doing.
Yeah.
You press these guys hard enough, they're going to say, well, my mind is just the product of all these impersonal Marxian type forces. Maybe not Michael because he's free market, but I mean, I've been on debate stages with evolutionary biologists will say, well, what is mind? I can't really make anything of that. And one of my colleagues, Paul Nelson, had this exchange with Niles Eldredge one time. He says, Niles, when you've written a brilliant book about punctuated equilibrium. When you get royalties sent to you, are they sent to all the impersonal forces that forced you to think what you thought and wrote in your book, or are they sent to the person, Niles Eldredge, who has a mind?
Well, I mean, it's a little bit.
This is the ultimate problem with materialism.
But there's also that idea of sort of like, you can break somebody down into their parts or anything into their parts. You could say
the reductionist.
Well, you could say
that's not
beings,
but
it was
no one
Thomas
thinks
Huxley
that's,
and Matthew Arnold had that debate. Where
that's
Thomas
not.
Huxley
No one
said,
thinks that's enough to explain complex systems.
Well, but I'm saying there's something about human beings.
I mean,
I'm
clearly,
going to quote Matthew Arnold that inspired this hominid with no tail to Greek. There's something that inspired us to the music of Mozart and the plays of Shakespeare and Euripides and Sophocles. There's something we seem to be. We do have a mind. It is capable of understanding, and it is curious and wants to understand more. And we do seem to we don't seem to be just materialists as human beings.
So
we
see,
seem
here
much more than that.
You're making a move there where you're reifying the word mind into something that like floats around separate from the neurons that are firing.
Right.
Because that's sort of a Buddhist way of looking at it, like the mind exists out there.
That's an inference.
Well, that may be.
There's a difference between my experience of the color blue on this water bottle and the neurochemistry that's going on in my brain. I have a direct experience of that as a conscious agent.
So do you
we
think
have names
mind,
for that? We call it consciousness. We call it mind. We call it mental properties. But you're not seriously not denying the existence of your own consciousness, are you?
No. It's
wouldn't
very
say
real.
That's a reification of chemistry.
What I mean is someone like Rupert Sheldrake, who thinks that mind exists out there in the quantum field. It's not in your brain.
Okay, I agree with that. That's a weird Platonic reification. I'm opposed to that as well.
Right.
Yeah.
But how about this? I mean, the idea that we are not. If you have a materialistic viewpoint, look, we have to sleep, we have to eat, we have to keep our body at a certain temperature, and there's all these things we do. But we also create beautiful art, great music, great plays, great paintings, a great story. And there, this is what Schopenhauer, I think, and even Nietzsche said, that sometimes you forget you're human when you watch these things. When you participate in them or you observe them, you forget you have to go to the bathroom, sleep. There's this inspiration that happens that for a brief moment, and we stay alive for these moments, and frankly, we might even die for these moments. These ideas, the first kiss, all these things that kind of make us feel transcendent. There's more to it out here than just this sort of I'm more than just a machine, for God's sake. I'm something that's connected to something. I guess maybe there's truth and beauty. Those ideas, those concepts might be romantic, but they're real. They really are real, aren't they?
Yes. Except, you know what you call love without evidence? Stalking.
What does that mean?
Stalking. You're stalking somebody.
Oh, stalking with love without evidence. I think stalking, that's great joke.
Love without evidence of reciprocity.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, but
I stole that, by the way, from the
funny.
comedian Tim Minchin. I wish
I'd read
that. Okay, so then one more question on this. So let's say I'm running an experiment at the CERN particle accelerator, or I'm using the LIGO gravitational wave experimental apparatus, and I discover something. How would introducing mind into the experiment, what value does it bring? How can I use it? What's the purpose of that? Or is it a higher metaphorical or metaphysical
well, maybe I can
or
answer
religious?
It this way. I can answer it this way. Do you believe in a priori knowledge, or is all knowledge based in experience?
Well, logic, mathematics, things like this, I think, are separate from human minds. I mean, this is a debatable point.
But that's an interesting thing, right? Theoretical math.
I mean, when someone like Max Tegmark says, well, the entire universe is all mathematical and whatever can be derived through equations has to exist, I'm like, I don't know. I'm not really sure I'm understanding this.
Well, there might be a number you can attach to
or we share some skepticism. Yeah.
Or we're living in a matrix. It's like, I don't know. Go outside and look. I don't see any buffering or any pixelated, I don't know. At some point, the metaphysics becomes like science fiction. It's fun and interesting. But so my point is, are we just talking sort of religion, metaphysics, philosophy?
I'm talking...
and the inference of mind in an experiment, is there some useful point of that?
Is there a moral sense? Is there an idea that we...
Can we bracket that and come back? I think Michael's asking something very specifically scientific, which I think I'd like to take a rip at. It may be that when we're looking at the Large Hadron Super Collider that there's no occasion for inferring the activity of a mind. The phenomenon that we may be studying may be perfectly well explained by the interaction of particles or energy, but it may be that there are other types of phenomena where the inference to mind is completely warranted in the philosophical sense. And the key principle that underlies that distinction is a principle of reasoning it's a part of Bayesian thinking. It's part of a method of reasoning that's commonly used in science called inference to the best explanation, where the best explanation is an explanation that invokes an entity which is known to have the powers to produce the effect in question, sometimes called the causal adequacy principle. Mm-hmm. So I invoke mind when mind is the entity which is known from our experience to be uniquely capable of producing the effect in question. I don't invoke mind when it is not uniquely known to have those powers, or when something else is uniquely known to have those powers. So just because mind is not always, or intelligence is not always a causally adequate explanation of certain phenomena, doesn't mean it's not sometimes the best explanation of others. If you walk into the British Museum and you stumble upon that wonderful artifact called the Rosetta Stone that has those etchings in 3 different languages, we don't infer that wind and erosion did it, because the archaeologists, after they broke the code, realized that they were dealing with inscriptions that were information-rich. There were 3 different linguistic texts, and they therefore inferred a scribe, an intelligence, had done it, because they know that mind can produce information and wind and erosion can't.
Do you find, Michael, that you lean in the idea that this kind of just all happened without purpose, or this was a happy accident?
Well, not well.
It's probably
happy
unfair.
accident.
It might be a little bit simple question. It's
Yeah,
probably
no,
unfair.
I get it. No, I understand what you're asking. It's not just chance and randomness. I'm arguing that the laws of nature have built into them the opportunity for complex adaptive systems to arise. You put energy into the system, and it counters entropy, and you get complexity just by pouring energy into the system, something like that. So we live in that kind of universe where that can happen naturally by itself without the invocation of a deity or a higher mind. And we do this all the time. How do you explain complex crystals? These beautiful 3-dimensional crystals with the sharp edges. Well, no one thinks, the intelligent designer goes in there and tweaks every crystal atom. We know this happens by a purely natural, or beehives are complex systems, but no one thinks the deity or the mind is pushing each bee to do his thing. It's all programmed. Right.
It's from somewhere.
Yeah, those are called self-organizational scenarios in origin of life research.
Yeah.
And they're very effective at explaining what does not need to be explained
Sure.
in life. They explain highly redundant order, and these are non-equilibrium. It's based on something called non-equilibrium thermodynamics. Prigogine was the great founder of this, and what he found is if you pushed energy through a system, contrary to the argument of a lot of creationists, you could get order for free. You could get order arising, but it was a highly symmetric form of order with a high degree of redundancy from an information standpoint. It's the same thing happening over and over again. You get vortices or spiral wave currents, or if you put a great example is drain your bathtub. Gravitational energy plus Coriolis forces will create a nicely ordered vortex, but that's not the kind of order we see in life. What we see in life is a code. We see it's a specified arrangement of characters that are highly complex to perform an overall function, and that is not produced by simply pumping order through a system. I used to have a visual aid I'd used to demonstrate this with my students. It was 2 Coke bottles that had been conjoined with a little plastic fitting, and I had a blue food coloring in the inside in water with some sparkles. And if I made a motion with my hand, I could get a vortex to form. And you get a nicely ordered system by putting energy through. Mm-hmm. But those sparkles didn't arrange themselves to make any messages. Right. You had at the micro level disorder, at the macro level order, but you didn't have specified complexity or information. And so those are real processes. I agree with Michael, but they don't explain the origin of life or the origin of the information
you guys are so,
needed to produce it.
You guys are so scientific, which is great. But let me.
You want to go back to the moral?
No,
beauty,
not necessarily.
Truth and beauty.
No. Well, of course I do, but forget that. But I do want to keep it. I appreciate that we keep going back to these things, and I love the difference between you two. But let me maybe rephrase it. Human beings have potential. There is a difference between, whenever we start talking about chimps and we start talking about bees and we start talking about systems, that's all great and it's all relevant. But there's a big difference between human beings and everybody else, everything else. And that is that we seem to have infinite potential to understand the universe we live in. And that is what we're doing here. And as you point out in your book, we seem to be getting closer and closer to this idea that maybe there is a code. And what does that mean? Because we work in code now. We're creating computers.
There definitely is a code.
There is a code.
Yeah,
with DNA.
It's been cracked.
But also we're creating computers in our likeness. It's a very interesting thing. So we have this, if you extrapolate our potential is, it seems to be limitless. My child was 16 months old. My kid, there's a chance, could live to 150 thanks to, regenerative
Maybe.
science, and who knows, right?
We don't know
Who
what
knows?
happens after you get to 130.
We don't.
'cause
I
no
don't
one's
want to
been
live
there.
that long, by the way. But
Do you know this book?
Is that the outside edge, Michael? Is that just
Well,
the-
it's actually
as long
about
as someone is-
115 to 120. There's debatable sources.
Depends on
of who
birth
said.
certificates.
Yeah.
That's where we
Yeah.
rely on
But
skeptic magazines.
That's what I love
we're
about
all
his,
over the
that's what I love about
longevity
Michael and
stuff,
his magazine.
You know, just you're gonna upload your connectome into the cloud. This is all nonsense. This is not going
Right.
to happen. And we have no idea what happens if you lived to 150. What other things? I mean, almost no one got Alzheimer's 500 years ago because no one lived long enough to get
Yeah.
Alzheimer's, right? So it'd be something like that. But that's slightly after. Okay, so but here's another hard problem. How does the mind interact with the physical stuff? Okay, it's a problem for all philosophers. How does the mind here, my mind, interact with the physical world? The same problem it seems to me theists have. So presumably, let's just say the mind or God or whoever reaches in to stir the particles to push RNA into DNA or the eye or whatever the system is that's complex. How does the mind do that? And how can I tell that that's what it's doing? That's my question.
I would say that's a problem for all philosophers, or all philosophies of science. Materialism, theism, pantheism. Nobody knows. It's called the mind-body problem.
So how does the mind what you mean, the signals or
Yeah, no, I just have a thought, and
the
somehow
interface between
it-
consciousness and the material substrate.
Well,
It's not understood.
I don't know,
It's-
but it certainly is felt. So I can observe myself.
Right.
I can step outside myself. You can see Buddhist monks. The pictures of the Buddhist monk who lit himself on fire and didn't even groan. All they heard was the air expelled from his lungs because he had separated from his body. So the mind can do things that are these contemplative athletes in the Himalayas, these Rinpoches, go talk to them. Whatever they're doing, they seem to be onto something.
I'm waiting for Michael's skeptical
no,
debunking of that claim.
but
those are stories.
they might be stories, but I've seen. But the guy did light himself on fire. My question. Let's go back to the potential.
That mind
What is
can
potential?
interact with physical stuff. Is no question about it. We do
Right.
it all the time.
Well, that's
But how?
that's
How
the
does
point.
it happen?
Why
because
our
we don't know
potential?
how it's done doesn't mean we can't infer that it was done when we see the distinctive effects of mind in the physical world.
Exactly.
And that's the basis of the design
It's like
inference.
belief. Didn't you say belief is the things that what's real is the things that you believe. Belief is real.
I
Because
don't want to believe in things that have to be believed in. They should just be out there on their own, whether I'm around or not. But again, my question for Stephen. So to what extent does the mind control everything, most things, just some things, just certain points? In other words, the fall of every sparrow is somehow part of the mind action with the world, God or whoever, or is it just the Cambrian explosion, DNA, the eye, whatever the steps,
These get into questions of what's called a theology of nature, and there's been a typical theology of nature among, say, for lack of a better word, Judeo-Christian theists since the period of the scientific revolution, and that is that they have typically affirmed there are two powers of God. One is what they call the potentia ordinata. It was in Newton's work. He wrote this wonderful epilogue to the Principia, and it's called the General Scholium. And he affirmed that God holds the universe together in an ongoing way, and that's the basis for what we call the laws of nature, the regularities that we observe in nature, for which we have no. At the fundamental physical level, as we've been saying, we don't have a materialistic explanation for gravity or the other fundamental forces of physics. These are things that always happen. At some level, we know not why. And Newton's view was those fundamental laws of nature, which we describe mathematically, they have beautiful mathematical precision and harmony, they are a mode of divine action. That's God's way of holding the universe together. So God is active in that constant, ongoing way, but God also acts in a discrete way at particular points in time, and the medieval theologians used to call that the potentia absoluta, that he acts discretely and constantly. And that's these get into questions of the theology of nature. So if you're a theist like I am, you're interested in those, in fleshing out your worldview in more detail, and you'd get into that.
If you're a romantic like me,
so just by way of example, the moment of conception where the sperm is allowed into the egg and all the other gazillion sperms are going, oh damn, I thought it was going to be me. I thought she'd pick me.
Right.
Right. And it's pretty miraculous. I mean, the whole story of how it unfolds in embryology, using the word miraculous is not unreasonable, right? It's amazing. But does anybody actually think, the mind or God is in there tweaking every little chemical reaction? No, I don't think so, right? This is all just part of the natural world by the laws of nature. Right?
Probably, but maybe, who knows? I don't have the answer to all such questions that good skeptics like Michael can offer. Doesn't mean that there aren't good grounds for affirming the things that I do affirm.
Well, there are mysteries like Goethe read Newton's book on light, on the properties of light, which is something like 1,400 pages long. And he said, I read this whole thing. And he's talking about light for 1,400 pages, and I learned nothing about beauty. It said nothing about beauty. It's kind of a funny,
he has this
romantic
amazing
idea.
passage in the Optics where he says,
have you read it?
Oh, well, yeah, I had to study this stuff. How is it that that light has properties that match the attributes, the designed parameters of the eye? That the eye, there's a principle of correspondence between the way the eye works and the exact chromatic properties of light. He said he saw in that a principle of correspondence that suggested design.
Wow.
And Michael's going to come back and say, well, Darwinian evolution explains the origin of the eye.
Damn you,
and
Michael.
Damn you, Michael. I say, bring it. I mean, that
Michael's always pissing on my parade. I'm all romanced by your argument, and he keeps interrupting.
We can't explain the origin of proteins, let alone the sophisticated visual apparatus like the vertebrate eye on Darwinian principles. The eye gave Darwin shivers. It still gives evolutionary biologists shivers.
Would it be fair to say that you're really trying to find measurable answers for and proving the idea that there's a mind behind all this, and you're always going to be the guy who says, I don't know.
Well, I eschew the word. I'll let Michael answer, but just to clarify my position, I eschew the word proof, because I'm using a method of reasoning that is provisional, as Michael
so on the
affirms.
Bayesian scale.
Either Bayesian or inference to the best explanation, which is a mode of reasoning that can dovetail with Bayesianism, as a kind of probabilistic mode of reasoning. But I think good philosophy moves not only debunks what's incorrect, it moves towards affirming our best understanding of reality. We want to bring things together in a synthetic vision of the whole that makes sense of the world. Bacon once said, there be those discoursing wits who counted a bondage to fix a belief. And he thought those were bad people. It's better to come to conclusions if we can, based on the evidence, rather than being perpetually skeptical. But I also have a very skeptical turn. I'm skeptical about some of the same things Michael's skeptical about, spoon benders and multiverses, but I also want to encourage him to apply a little more skepticism to things like neo-Darwinism, which leading evolutionary biologists are now saying, hey, it's not cutting it, we need a new theory.
Yeah, Michael.
I don't think we need a new theory. I think the tweaking of neo-Darwinism will continue. But just on a broader point, again, back to where we started, I don't know. And I don't want to be like Lord Kelvin in 1890, whatever that was. And he said, well, we're pretty much done now with physics. And then Einstein comes along and is like, oh, okay, we're not done. And, could be 500 years from now if we get chronically frozen and are brought back and we have another podcast episode going, oh, that's what dark matter was, or that's the explanation for consciousness, or whatever. I just don't know. That's entirely possible. Given what we know about the history of science, if you go back 500 years, I wouldn't even known of the stuff we know now, right? So I don't know is a reasonable position to be in. Do you know about the Mysterian philosophers, Mysterian mysteries?
No.
These are the position that what we know is very much dependent on the size of our brains, the structure of our brains, and so on. And that had we had a brain, twice the size or 10 times the size, we would be able to solve different kinds of problems. And but also conceptually, there's some problems that can't be resolved ultimately, like free will and determinism, because what do you mean by these words? Or the existence of God. There's a few of those that the Mysterian philosophy, consciousness is one. They just say that it's not solvable. It's not a soluble problem.
But Michael, we do know that you're interested in the questions. And that is that is a direction. And so I keep
think that's a
saying,
very
Well,
good
but this is
point.
their
Yeah.
point, is that we're smart enough to ask the questions
Yes,
and
but-
conceive of the problem,
Well,
but
if we
not
are,
answer it.
but if
I'm not
we
sure I'm a
are-
Mysterian.
but-
I'm just saying that
Right.
there are good thinkers that think like this.
right, but you are somebody, I love that you're a skeptic, but you are still interested in these questions, which means
How could you not be interested?
Well, whether you're
They're
not,
super interesting.
but that means you're trying to get closer to
Yeah,
a
that's true.
point,
Yes.
the
Yes.
truth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that we're all here trying to get closer to the truth. So I say to you that you may not know, and there may be plenty of facts and plenty of, and as the evidence comes along, but it does seem that human beings are being nudged in a direction. And if we are being nudged in a direction, thanks to all these discoveries.
Nudged or pulled or pushed?
I don't know.
What do you mean?
I don't
Okay.
know. Either nudged together, nudged in a direction.
Do you mean toward complexity, or do you mean toward love?
I mean,
or something
you
like
know,
this?
Don't put words in my mouth. But I think toward. I like the idea of truth. I like a higher truth, the highest truth. There seems to be at the height of. We all have this hierarchy of values. There does the most logical explanation to me seems to be that there is an objective truth. There are plural truths. I look at a painting and I say, that's a beautiful painting. The Sistine Chapel brings me to my knees, but a chemist comes along and says, it's actually not yellow. Your eyes are playing a trick to you. Your visual apparatus is very blah, blah, blah. And that's another truth. And then somebody else says, well, there's actually a bunch of atoms there and it's quarks, so it's actually not even matter. Fucking A. Now I'm once again. But kiss my ass. I know that something that's closer to God than watching a baboon throw his shit at me from the zoo. There's something about that, baby, that's just astonishing, awe-inspiring me, and brings me to my knees.
But you can
and
have
I want to live
both.
in that world.
You can have
I
both.
do have both,
Yeah.
but I'm saying that human beings have potential, and we were given potential, it seems, imagination, and this limitless curiosity to do something. We are moving in some direction. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
I win, Stephen. I win. We've changed the skeptic.
Well,
you got to change your.
he
You
made
got to change your.
he made an affirmation, but
Yeah.
in Michael's defense, I think it is perfectly appropriate to say I don't know about a whole bunch of questions.
I love him. That's what I love him
and
for.
the
He's so
null
important.
hypothesis is a legitimate hypothesis in science. Sometimes we know what's false, but we don't yet have a better explanation. But I want to get back to your point about nudging.
Yeah.
Because this was the point.
the
This
word.
was really the point of my book. We've got these major discoveries about biological, physical, cosmological origins, and they're not at all what 20th century scientific materialists expected. None of them thought that the universe was going to have a beginning. Einstein twisted himself into knots trying to get his cosmological constant to have exactly the right value so that he could portray gravity, the outward push of the cosmological constant and the inward pull of gravity to get him exactly finely tuned so he could portray the universe as a static entity. And then lo and behold, the heavens talked back, and the evidence of the red shift and multiple other lines of evidence said, no, the universe had a beginning. If you look at an animation today of the expanding universe with the now 2 trillion galaxies moving outward in that vast, roughly spherical expansion of the universe, and then you wind that animation backwards, what it looks like for all the world is everything converging to a point. And in fact, physically speaking, that's what is going on. You can't back extrapolate any further than that creation event. And now,
That's wild.
you add to that.
What is that theory?
Well, this is the Big Bang Theory,
Okay,
right?
yeah.
Okay, and it's based on multiple lines of empirical evidence, astronomical observations, but it's also, there are 2 lines of effectively proof, and I use that very cautiously, but the proofs that were offered by Hawking, Penrose, and George Ellis of a singular beginning to the universe where matter, space-time, and energy begin at a point. And then you have a proof based on special relativity which was not based on, isn't based on general relativity and therefore not subject to some loopholes associated with that. So you've got these multiple lines of evidence pointing to a beginning. Now, are there ways to circumvent that with creative theorizing? Yes, there are. But my point has been those ways of creatively theorizing have their own theistic implications. And in any case, the attempt to circumvent what seems to be the most natural conclusion from the evidence and the considerations from physical theory are getting very, very weird. They get. It's like the old cycles within cycles when people are trying to avoid the heliocentric universe. You have, and so you've got the universe from nothing idea conjoined with quantum cosmology. You've got the cyclic conformal cosmology of Penrose. Then you get to get around the multiverse, you've got people, or get around the fine tuning, you've got multiverses. You've got people positing panspermia.
But I'm told they don't do that to get around that. That it's a derivative of the equations.
You can generate a multiverse that way, but its popularity, I think, derives from large part. Leonard Susskind very honestly put it. He said, the multiverse is highly counterintuitive, but without the multiverse, he said, we'd be hard pressed to answer the ID critics. And in any case, even if you posit
What's the ID? Intelligent
design. But in any case, even if you posit a multiverse, it's only plausible if you have universe-generating mechanisms. The two that have been proposed are string theory and inflationary cosmology, and both of them require prior unexplained fine-tuning to generate new universes.
We're back to the
so
same
you're back
problem.
to where you started.
Back to the same
so the
problem.
fine-tuning issue has not been solved by materialism, but fine-tuning in our experience is a product of mind, thus the inference to design.
Are you a materialist? If I called you that, you're a naturalist.
Yeah.
What is the difference?
As opposed to what? Supernaturalism?
I don't know. Well, what's the difference?
This is always my question. So he used the word materialism for naturalism. Okay, so let's say
does that argument not sway you, Michael?
The natural world is naturalists say that the natural world is made of matter and energy.
Right.
So
does that crack your naturalism?
And mathematics probably really exists separate from human mind, something like that. Okay, but that's a debatable point. But we're back to this: how does the mind do it? So if you invoke the mind to bang the Big Bang out of nothing, how does a mind create something out of nothing? We're still left with that problem, and maybe nothing is the odd thing, and it's too unstable, so something has to exist. Hawking's quantum foam fluctuation. Right. Universes are popping in and out all the time, and so on. But if you say, well, no, the mind is doing that. Well, how does the mind do that? This God or whatever. We're still left with that problem.
Well, I think that's his.
Yeah, but sure, but we don't know how our own minds generate the conversation we're generating right now. Not knowing how that's done does not prevent us from inferring that it is being done,
right.
Mm-hmm. and we can infer that with warrant or with justification when we see features in our observable reality, which we know from our experience are only produced by minds. That's the causal adequacy principle I was referring to earlier.
Yeah, let me share two stories from a mathematician and from a writer. So Flannery O'Connor, great writer, said, I sit at my typewriter every morning, not to write, but in case something happens. So I keep showing up until the story reveals itself to me. It's an act of faith, right?
Michael and I have both written enough books that we can appreciate
that.
Yeah.
So
I wonder what he's going to say today.
And that's what I do. That's how I write stand-up. It's like I know the joke is up there in the big template in the sky. And if I just keep showing up every day, it's just and sometimes just sitting there and my wife is like, what are you doing? And I'm talking to myself and I'm miserable because nothing's coming, right?
That's great.
But it's kind of a cool idea of thinking of yourself rather than a mind. Sometimes you think of yourself as a beacon, sort of an antenna, a radio receiver, and a guy who won the Fields Medal in mathematics. He was a Russian guy. He refused the award, and they found him a year later in his aunt's shed in Siberia, and he was working on another theorem. And the theorem was some crazy thing. It was like 357 pages long, the one he won the Fields Medal for. And he said, "Well, you guys are trying to give the award to the radio." You're giving the award to the receiver. You're not giving the award to the template in the sky. The equation already existed up there.
Yeah.
So give the award to that rather than to the person who was able to receive it.
Like Michelangelo is releasing the image of David in the
I
marble.
love that, right? He said, it's in there already. I got to get all the shit out of the way. It's a beautiful way of looking at art and a human being.
The Amadeus movie about Mozart.
Yeah.
Hey, can I say something about the math?
Yes.
I'm
trying to romance him. I'm trying to get Michael to come over to our side.
I was at a conference last fall, and one of there were two leading mathematicians there, one from Oxford, John Lennox, whose name I can share in this context, who told me that the other mathematician there was a 2 league tables above him in the hierarchy of great mathematicians, one of the top 3 guys in the world, maybe.
Wow.
And anyway, this other mathematician, whose name I'm not going to reveal yet, but can in a year or so when he comes out with a book that we're going to be publishing, he took me aside and said, I love your new book, Return of the God Hypothesis. He said, my wife's an agnostic, but after reading it, she's going wobbly, he said.
Wow.
But he said, I have a
How
beef
cool is
with
that?
you. He said, you got 3 the 3 discoveries that reveal the mind behind the universe. He says, there's one more. It's math. And I had just read a long essay that he had written, and I kind of knew where he was going with this, but he starts to explain. He says, all mathematicians are basically mathematical Platonists. They believe mathematical structures, equations, mathematical objects, as the mathematicians call them, circles, geometric forms, have an objective reality. A circle has all the same properties to every geometer, irrespective of their preference. We're not
their language,
relativists.
their location on the earth.
The quadratic equation or differential equations, they have certain properties and they are stable and they are mind independent. And yet they are independent of our perceptions, but they are conceptual. They are not physical, they are not material. So they're objective, they're conceptual, but they do not. But mathematicians believe they are discovered, not invented.
They're
because they have a reality independent of ours. Well, if they're
that's one of the great ideas of philosophy, Pythagorean theorem,
Exactly.
a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That reality exists, whether you're here or not. Whether the firmament is here, it doesn't matter. That's a reality.
So if they're conceptual, meaning mental, and they're not, and they're independent of our perceptions, in whose mind do they exist? And this mathematician, now writing a book on this with our colleague David Berlinski, says this seems to point
this is deep shit.
towards an immaterial mind, towards theism. And so
Michael,
you missed.
That's a number 3 mathematician in the
you
world,
missed something,
Michael.
Meyer. He said it should be four
cool.
things that reveal the mind.
That's so
behind the
cool,
universe.
though. What an endorsement.
Let's see what numbers 1 and 2 think of that.
Son of a bitch. Son of a bitch. He had to get the number 1 and number 2.
Well, because but again, how does science work? It's very much a collective social enterprise of trying to convince your colleagues that you've got something worth listening to and that you have evidence for it.
Sure.
And if you don't, well, that's just the way it goes. I mean, I get letters all the time from people that, that they have an alternative theory of physics too. There's hundreds of them. But most of them.
This isn't an alternative theory of math. This is a question,
I understand.
This is a question of the
that's not my
philosophy
point.
of
Yes, of course.
mathematics.
Yeah.
And it happens that most mathematicians are mathematical Platonists. They recognize this objectivity and immateriality of mathematical objects. And that raises a question. If something's conceptual, in which mind does it reside if it doesn't reside in ours?
In the template in the sky, and that would be God.
Well, okay, so
that would be Yahweh.
I mean, so take some basic laws of nature, like when a star gets to a certain temperature, it fuses hydrogen into helium, and you can describe this with math. All right, but where is that description? I mean, where's the math existing? I mean, it's not in the star; it's where? I mean, it's in somebody's mind describing, but the process is actually happening. It's out there.
It's separate from us, isn't it?
But we use words to describe it, or we have equations to describe it. Where are those? This is a hard problem.
It's a great question, and it's one of the reasons that I think quantum cosmology, the alternative to a straight-up Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God, has its own theistic implications. Quantum cosmology does, because the explanans, the thing doing the explaining in quantum cosmology, is a mathematical function called a universal wave function and an apparatus that stands behind that called the Wheeler-DeWitt equation and superspace. There's this whole mathematical apparatus that pre-exists the universe, the physical universe, and the physical universe is explained as a consequence of the mathematics that pre-exists the universe. Now, the people, the guys at the forefront of this, not the popularizers, but people like Vilenkin, have said, wait a minute, doesn't that imply then, aren't we then saying, maybe we don't want to be saying this, maybe inadvertently we're saying this, but doesn't that imply that there's a mind behind the universe? And Hawking himself tumbled to this uncomfortable realization. He said, what is it that puts fire in the equations that gives them a universe to describe? And what he's saying, he's building off of what Michael just said, is that math by itself has it's causally inert. It It's
just there.
conceptual. It's not a physical thing that causes other physical things to happen.
Yes, it is. Though.
So,
but I mean, there are theoretical theorems that later on. So somebody writes a theorem. Somebody dedicates his life to a theorem. They die at 85. 100 years later, somebody pulls that off the shelf.
Well, that
to
is,
use to measure
that
X,
is
Y,
a
and
crazy.
Z.
This mathematician that I was talking about.
I mean, that's incredible. To
This
me.
is what his essay was about: is this the unreasonable applicability of mathematics to the physical world. Quantum mechanics was developed. The mathematics of complex variables was developed long before it had any application on the basis of pure deductions, mathematical deductions from first principles, and then 100 years later, so it turns out to be absolutely critical to doing quantum mechanics. And there are many, many examples of this in the history of physics. What is it that why does John Polkinghorne, the great Cambridge physicist, used to say, why does the reason within the mathematics that we develop on the basis of our deductive reasoning match and describe precisely the reason that is built into the universe, the design of the universe? And he says the best explanation for that is, again, theism. It provides a principle of correspondence that the same God who made the design, the rationality, the orderly patterns we see in nature, made our minds in such a way to discern the mathematical structure that is inherent in those systems, and that's why we can do science. And actually, that principle of correspondence was one of the key things that inspired the scientific revolution. It was called the principle of intelligibility. And all the great theists who were the early founders of modern science, Boyle, Kepler, Newton, believed that nature was intelligible and could be understood by the human mind because the design in nature issued from the same intelligence, namely God, who made our minds
in his likeness,
so that we could understand nature.
It's a hell of an argument. I mean,
Although I should point out, since I
can
mentioned,
feel Michael's skepticism.
You mentioned Max Tegmark before. He deals with the same problems and does not come to the theistic conclusion at all.
Well,
he's always got to bring the spoil sport into the party.
Well, what Tegmark does is says that every mathematical structure that's logically possible must exist in some possible world. And
I'm not. But my point was this: I'm not.
And
sure
Michael
I'm
and I are both skeptical about that.
I don't know.
That does nothing to undermine
but the point is that
argument.
it's not necessarily the right induction to the best explanation. Theism. I mean, it could be that we're just going to hit an epistemological wall where we just can't know, like what was there before the Big Bang, what was there before time began. Again, Hawking's analogy: what's north of the North Pole? How does something come from nothing? Well, what do you mean by nothing? Well, not only just no matter, space, time, energy, but no logic, no ideas, no gods, nothing. No eternity.
No laws of physics, Lawrence Krauss. Sorry, you're cheating.
Yeah, nothing. I mean, you wouldn't even have no thing. I mean, the word itself, no thing, implies there's a thing that doesn't exist. True nothing wouldn't even be that. There's no eternity because there's no time. At some point, I don't even know what I'm talking about.
Right.
These words are just like, well,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, I think for what it's worth, you make a hell of an argument to me. I've been romanced.
Damn, I was going to get you some flowers.
Michael still
take you out to dinner.
He still holds firm. I know. I'm a soft touch.
It's always a great iron sharpening iron conversation with Michael.
You guys are great. Yeah, it's great.
I always feel, first of all, I always enjoy the interactions with him, but I always feel like anybody who has interest in these deep questions, irrespective of what side of the argument they're on, is, to me, a friend and a colleague, a kindred spirit.
Yeah.
Because, there's a lot of people that just go through life, just don't want to think about it.
They're not interested in the questions.
And that's to me, just not the unexamined life is not worth living, said Socrates. I kind of agree with him on that.
I'm right with you on that.
Yeah.
Well, and if you're right, I guess I'll find out.
Yeah, you will.
And I'm kind of hoping, that God will go, hey, at least Shermer gave it a shot. We'll let him in.
well, yeah, Michael. I mean, what I love about you is that you're always interested in the truth, and you're tireless in asking the right questions and pushing back, and you live a moral life. I mean, being a moral objectivist is to me, whether we all slip up here and there, but for the most part, there is scaffolding.
He puts out a fine
scaffolding.
magazine too.
Skeptic is a great
A lot of
magazine.
the stuff that he's skeptical about, I'm skeptical about.
Skeptic is a great
ID
magazine.
colleagues are as well.
Thank you.
Well, your magazine is very important, especially now when everybody's coming up with their own truth. My final
Big
question,
crisis in our culture
huge
actually is crisis of authority.
Well, there's nobody can even
you
agree
got
on where
people
the
skeptical
origins.
about people overstating certainty about science, but then that means that then people just are throwing babies out with bathwater.
That's right.
And we got to find a happy medium
That's
here
exactly
where
right.
we learn to evaluate scientific claims and keep the debate open, but also we have to respect people that have done the hard work to come to some conclusions that are necessary for us to live our lives.
Objective truth.
Yeah,
Are
exactly.
you religious at all?
I am personally religious. I'm a Christian. Like sometimes say denominationally confused Christian, but
Yep.
I'm also attracted.
Why Christianity?
I believe that there is evidence in support of the reliability of the New Testament, and I think there's evidence actually of a design to the Bible that's quite compelling, that makes it self-authenticating as an unusual source of truth. And I'm very compelled by the person of Jesus Christ. I think he's for reasons that you stated.
I want to ask my question that I ask everybody on this particular question. Why don't Jews believe this? They believe in the same God, the same book, at least the Old Testament. They know all the arguments for the resurrection of Jesus, the empty tomb and Mary and the apparitions, the whole thing, the eyewitnesses and so on. They don't accept it. Why is that? You can't say, well, if they understood the arguments, they'd accept the resurrection of Jesus.
My answer would be one of the great strengths of the Jews is their endless capacity for debate, and the idea of you could show you could show a room full of rabbis a miracle, and all of them would be like, but how can we be sure of that? And how do we know I'm not being tricked? And I think that part of progress is always saying, I'm not really going to rely on what I've been told. I'm going to find out for myself.
Well, but I asked Ben Shapiro this on his show. He's Jewish, and he goes, well, because the Old Testament did not predict that that's who would come, that the carpenter from Nazareth, that it would be a warrior, not a peacemaker, and so he had his arguments based on Old Testament. Okay, so why does it? If he listened to your arguments, would he become a Christian?
I think it's well beyond the scope of this discussion to get into the case for Christianity one way or another. But I would say your retort, your question, is a kind of ad hominem, in not the sense it's an insult, but it's really trying to base the truth based on what one person or another does or doesn't believe. And I think to really evaluate the question, you have to look at the evidence itself. I will say there is an interesting contemporary phenomenon, which is that there are more and more ethnically Jewish people who are adopting Christianity by belief. Now, I have very close Orthodox Jewish friends, very close conservative Jewish friends, very close secular Jewish friends. My friend Berlinski invites people of all those persuasions and people, Gentile academics. We do a conference most years in Europe. Last year we had, I think, 13 Jewish scientists and scholars. 5 of them were Christian by belief, underscoring the old maxim, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. I don't think it's as simple as all Jews reject or all Jews accept. And in any case, I don't think you can tell.
He was a rabbi.
I don't think you can tell. You can't tell the truth about any proposition by simply counting heads about who does or doesn't believe it. I think you got to get into the evidence, and you got to apply the Bayesian type analysis.
Is there
Michael
a book
favors.
or is there an argument that swayed you? Because you said that there was about the New Testament. There was.
My story is that for all these scientific arguments that I've been making, the thing that deeply persuaded me, first of theism and eventually of Christianity, were more philosophical types of arguments or perceptions. I had an existential crisis as a 14-year-old. It's a little embarrassing, but I had questions that I later learned the French existentialist philosophers were asking, and I didn't know where they were coming from. I just thought it meant something was wrong with me. And so I had a period in my early adolescence where I was afraid I was going insane because I was asking questions like, what's it going to matter in 100 years? I couldn't imagine anything that I did in my daily routine that would have any lasting value. I read a book about baseball and all my heroes and, the history of baseball. And, when they got to 40 years old, they had their records. And then what? I mean, what was the point? Eventually there's just going to be some numbers on a piece of paper, and I kept thinking, well, but what's the point of anything I might accomplish? And later in college, I was taking a course on existentialism and came across this passage in Sartre where he says, without an infinite reference point, nothing finite has any lasting or enduring meaning. Well, that's just axiomatic. And so that sense that all of us have that, when we die, we rot, and then what did it all mean? I think it was a haunting thing for me as a teenager. And then I started thinking about time, and I couldn't make sense of that. And so I was a mess, and I started reading the big fat Catholic family Bible. We were nominally Catholic, hardly ever went to church. And as I started reading it, first of all, I was compelled by the figure of Jesus Christ. I for the sort of reasons you were describing, and it's just an extraordinary person. But then there were passages in the Bible that spoke to these deeper philosophical questions that I had. I had this intuitive sense that there must be something that didn't change. We live in this world, the ephemeral nature of our sense perceptions. I hold up this water bottle, I drop it to the table. I can remember now that event from 3 seconds ago, but it's permanently gone. And where did it go? And I had this sense there must be something that doesn't change, or else all this constant flux of the empirical sense perceptions of the world floating by me is ultimately meaningless. There's got to be some grounding, and I can't prove that even now speaking, but it was this deep intuitive sense I had. And then I came across passages in the Bible like Yahweh revealing Himself to Moses at the burning bush and revealing that His name was the I am that I am, or in the New Testament, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And I thought, this is worth investigating, because if these claims are true, some of these haunting philosophical questions and I didn't really know they were philosophical questions until I got to college. I had a professor, when I was taking the course in existentialism, I said, "Oh, I wasn't insane." I said, "I was just a philosopher." And the prof says, "Yeah, but there's a fine line between philosophy and insanity.
You're damn right there is.
Be careful." Anyway, sorry to go on about the
I
personal
appreciate
stuff,
it.
but
Maybe
so for me, it was a long. I didn't have a Damascus Road conversion. It was a long period of angst,
more intellectual.
Yeah, but I found there are really intellectually satisfying answers in that Judeo-Christian tradition. And I have conversations with people across all these worldview divides and religious divides, and I just think it's really a good thing for our culture to be refocusing on this, because we've gotten distracted by other themes and other concerns, and I think that's a reason for a lot of that.
Since you mentioned baseball, I should point out Steve Gould used to say that DiMaggio's 56-game hitting streak was totally transcendent. It should never have happened. It was miraculous.
It was the one thing that would have convinced him. Yeah.
Gentlemen, this has been awesome.
All right.
To both of you, I really enjoyed it.
Wow. Yeah. And I'm glad I was able to follow it. I just consider that an accomplishment.
You did a great job leading it.
Listen,
getting a couple guys like us is like
I'm in high cotton. I'm in high cotton here. And
Michael, thank you.
All right, very good.
You guys are
all righty.
Thanks,
Yeah, that was great.
Awesome.
Really fun.
Come back anytime, man.
All
We'll
right.
do a round 2, round 3. I want to get into this more.